Capital Punishment by Charles Dickens. I will take for the subject of this letter the effect of capital punishment on the commission of crime, or rather of murder, the only crime with one exception, and that a rare one to which it is now applied. Its effect in preventing crime I will reserve for another letter, and a few of the more striking illustrations of each aspect of the subject for a concluding one. The effect of capital punishment on the commission of murder. Some murders are committed in hot blood and furious rage, some in deliberate revenge, some in terrible despair, some, but not many, for mere gain, some for the removal of an object dangerous to the murderer's peace or good name, some to win a monstrous notoriety. On murders committed in rage, in the despair of strong affection, as when a starving child is murdered by its parent, or for gain, I believe the punishment of death to have no effect in the least. In the two first cases, the impulse is a blind and wild one, infinitely beyond the reach of any reference to the punishment. In the last, there is little calculation beyond the absorbing greed of the money to be got. Courvoisier, for example, might have robbed his master with greater safety, and with fewer chances of detection, if he had not murdered him. But his calculations going to the gain and not to the loss, he had no balance for the consequences of what he did. So, it would have been more safe and prudent in the woman who was hanged a few weeks since, for the murder in Westminster, to have simply robbed her old companion in an unguarded moment, as in her sleep. But her calculation going to the gain of what she took to be a bank note, and the poor old woman living between her and the gain, she murdered her. On murders committed in deliberate revenge, or to remove a stumbling block in the murderer's path, or in an insatiate craving for notoriety, is there reason to suppose that the punishment of death has the direct effect of an incentive and an impulse? A murder is committed in deliberate revenge. The murderer is at no trouble to prepare his train of circumstances, takes little or no pains to escape, is quite cool and collected, perfectly content to deliver himself up to the police, makes no secret of his guilt, but boldly says, "I killed him. I'm glad of it, I meant to do it, I am ready to die. There was such a case the other day. There was such another case not long ago. There are such cases frequently. It is the commonest first exclamation on being seized. Now, what is this but a false arguing of the question, announcing a foregone conclusion, expressly leading to the crime, and inseparably arising out of the punishment of death? I took his life. I give up mine to pay for it. Life for life, blood for blood. I have done the crime. I am ready with the atonement. I know all about it. It's a fair bargain between me and the law. Here am I to execute my part of it. And what more is to be said or done? It is the very essence of the maintenance of this punishment for murder, that it does set life against life. It is in the essence of a stupid, weak, or otherwise ill-regulated mind, of such a murderer's mind, in short, to recognize in this set-off, a something that diminishes the base and coward character of murder. In a pitched battle, I, a common man, may kill my adversary, but he may kill me. In a duel, a gentleman may shoot his opponent through the head, but the opponent may shoot him too, and this makes it fair. Very well. I take this man's life for a reason I have, or choose to think I have, and the law takes mine. The law says, and the clergyman says, there must be blood for blood and life for life. Here it is, I pay the penalty. A mind incapable or confounded in its perceptions, and you must argue with reference to such a mind, or you could not have such a murder, may not only establish on these grounds an idea of strict justice and fair reparation, but a stubborn and dogged fortitude and foresight that satisfy it hugely. Whether the fact be really so, or not, is a question I would be content to rest, alone, on the number of cases of revengeful murder in which this is well known, without dispute, to have been the prevailing demeanor of the criminal, and in which such speeches and such absurd reasoning have been constantly uppermost with him. Blood for blood and life for life, and such like balance jingles, have passed current in people's mouths from legislators downwards until they have been corrupted into tit for tat and acted on. Next come the murders done to sweep out of the way a dreaded or detested object. At the bottom of this class of crimes, there is a slow, corroding, growing hate. Violent quarrels are commonly found to have taken place between the murdered person and the murderer, usually of opposite sexes. There are witnesses to old scenes of reproach and recrimination, in which they were the actors, and the murderer has been heard to say, in this or that coarse phrase, that he wouldn't mind killing her, though he should be hanged for it. In these cases, the commonest avowal. It seems to me that in this well-known scrap of evidence, there is a deeper meaning than is usually attached to it. I do not know, but it may be, I have a strong suspicion that it is, a clue to the slow growth of the crime and its gradual development in the mind. More than this, a clue to the mental connection of the deed, with the punishment to which the doer of that deed is liable, until the two, conjoined, give birth to monstrous and misshapen murder. The idea of murder, in such a case, like that of self-destruction in the great majority of instances, is not a new one. It may have presented itself to the disturbed mind in a dim shape and afar off, but it has been there. After a quarrel, or with some strong sense upon him of irritation or discomfort arising out of the continuance of this life in his path, the man has brooded over the unformed desire to take it, though he should be hanged for it. With the entrance of the punishment into his thoughts, the shadow of the fatal beam begins to attend, not on himself but on the object of his hate. At every new temptation, it is there, stronger and blacker yet, trying to terrify him. When she defies or threatens him, the scaffold seems to be her strength and vantage ground. Let her not be too sure of that, though he should be hanged for it. Thus he begins to raise up, in the contemplation of this death by hanging, a new and violent enemy to brave. The prospect of a slow and solitary expiation would have no congeniality with his wicked thoughts, but this throttling and strangling has. There is always before him an ugly, bloody scarecrow phantom that champions her, as it were, and yet shows him in a ghastly way the example of murder. Is she very weak or very trustful in him, or infirm or old? It gives a hideous courage to what would be mere slaughter otherwise. For there it is, a presence always about her, darkly menacing him with that penalty whose murky secret has a fascination for all secret and unwholesome thoughts. And when he struggles with his victim at the last, though he should be hanged for it, it is a merciless wrestle, not with one weak life only, but with that ever-haunting, ever-beckoning shadow of the gallows, too, and with a fierce defiance to it, after their long survey of each other, to come on and do its worst. Present this black idea of violence to a bad mind contemplating violence. Hold up before a man remotely compassing the death of another person, the spectacle of his own ghastly and untimely death by man's hands, and out of the depths of his own nature, you shall assuredly raise up that which lures and tempts him on. The laws which regulate those mysteries have not been studied or cared for by the maintainers of this law, but they are paramount and will always assert their power. Out of 167 persons under sentence of death in England, questioned at different times, in the course of years, by an English clergyman in the performance of his duty, there were only 3 who had not been spectators of executions. We come now to the consideration of those murders which are committed or attempted with no other object than the attainment of an infamous notoriety. That this class of crimes has its origin in the punishment of death, we cannot question, because, as we have already seen, and shall presently establish by another proof, great notoriety and interest attach, and are generally understood to attach, only to those criminals who are in danger of being executed. One of the most remarkable instances of murder originating in mad self-conceit, and of the murderer's part in the repulsive drama, in which the law appears at such great disadvantage to itself and to society, being acted almost to the last with a self-complacency that would be horribly ludicrous if it were not utterly revolting, is presented in the case of Hawker. Here is an insolent, flippant, dissolute youth, aping the man of intrigue and levity, overdressed, overconfident, inordinately vain of his personal appearance, distinguished as to his hair, cane, snuff-box, and singing voice, and unhappily the son of a working shoemaker, bent on loftier flights than such a poor house swallow as a teacher in a Sunday school can take, and having no truth, industry, perseverance, or other dull workaday quality to plume his wings withal. He casts about him, in his jaunty way, for some mode of distinguishing himself, some means of getting that head of hair into the print shops, of having something like justice done to his singing voice and fine intellect, of making the life and adventures of Thomas Hawker remarkable, and of getting up some excitement in connection with that slighted piece of biography. The stage? No, not feasible. There has always been a conspiracy against the Thomas Hawkers in that kind of effort. It has been the same with authorship in prose and poetry. Is there nothing else? A murder now would make a noise in the papers. There is the gallows, to be sure, but without that it would be nothing. Short of that it wouldn't be fame. Well, we must all die at one time or other, and to die game and have it in print is just the thing for a man of spirit. They always die game at the minor theaters and the saloons, and the people like it very much. Thurtell, too, died very game and made a capital speech when he was tried. There's all about it in a book at the cigar shop now. Come, Tom, get your name up. Let it be a dashing murder that shall keep the wood engravers at it for the next 2 months. You are the boy to go through with it and interest the town. The miserable wretch, inflated by this lunatic conceit, arranges his whole plan for publication and effect. It is quite an epitome of his experience of the domestic melodrama or penny novel. There is the victim friend, the mysterious letter of the injured female to the victim friend, the romantic spot for the death struggle by night, the unexpected appearance of Thomas Hawker to the policeman, the parlor of the public house with Thomas Hawker reading the paper to a strange gentleman, the family apartment with a song by Thomas Hawker, the inquest room with Thomas Hawker boldly looking on, the interior of the Marylebone Theatre with Thomas Hawker taken into custody, the police office with Thomas Hawker affable to the spectators, the interior of Newgate with Thomas Hawker preparing his defense, the court where Thomas Hawker with his dancing master airs is put upon his trial, and complimented by the judge. The prosecution, the defense, the verdict, the black cap, the sentence, each of them a line in any playbill, and how bold a line in Thomas Hawker's life. It is worthy of remark that the nearer he approaches to the gallows, the great last scene to which the whole of these effects have been working up, the more the overweening conceit of the poor wretch shows itself, the more he feels that he is the hero of the hour, the more audaciously and recklessly he lies in supporting the character in public at the condemned sermon. He deports himself as becomes the man whose autographs are precious, whose portraits are innumerable, in memory of whom whole fences and gates have been borne away in splinters from the scene of murder. He knows that the eyes of Europe are upon him, but he is not proud, only graceful. He bows, like the first gentleman in Europe, to the turnkey who brings him a glass of water, and composes his clothes and hassock as carefully as good Madame Blaise could do. In private, within the walls of the condemned cell, every word and action of his waning life is a lie. His whole time is divided between telling lies and writing them. If he ever have another thought, it is for his genteel appearance on the scaffold, as when he begs the barber not to cut his hair too short, or they won't know him when he comes out. His last proceeding but one is to write 2 romantic love letters to women who have no existence. His last proceeding of all, but less characteristic, though the only true one, is to swoon away, miserably, in the arms of the attendants, and be hanged up like a craven dog. Is not such a history, from first to last, a most revolting and disgraceful one? And can the student of it bring himself to believe that it ever could have place in any record of facts, or that the miserable chief actor in it could have ever had a motive for his arrogant wickedness, but for the comment and the explanation which the punishment of death supplies? It is not a solitary case, nor is it a prodigy, but a mere specimen of a class. The case of Oxford, who fired at Her Majesty in the Park, will be found, on examination, to resemble it very nearly in the essential feature. There is no proved pretense whatever for regarding him as mad, other than that he was like this malefactor, brimful of conceit, and a desire to become, even at the cost of the gallows, the only cost within his reach, the talk of the town. He had less invention than Hawker, and perhaps was not so deliberately bad, but his attempt was a branch of the same tree, and it has its root in the ground where the scaffold is erected. Oxford had his imitators. Let it never be forgotten in the consideration of this part of the subject, how they were stopped. So long as attempts invested them with the distinction of being in danger of death at the hangman's hands, so long did they spring up. When the penalty of death was removed, and a mean and humiliating punishment substituted in its place, the race was at an end and ceased to be. We come, now, to consider the effect of capital punishment in the prevention of crime. Does it prevent crime in those who attend executions? There never is, and there never was an execution at the Old Bailey in London, but the spectators include 2 large classes of thieves. One class who go there as they would go to a dog fight, or any other brutal sport, for the attraction and excitement of the spectacle. The other who make it a dry matter of business, and mix with the crowd solely to pick pockets. Add to these the dissolute, the drunken, the most idle, profligate, and abandoned of both sexes, some moody ill-conditioned minds, drawn thither by a fearful interest, and some impelled by curiosity, of whom the greater part are of an age and temperament rendering the gratification of that curiosity highly dangerous to themselves and to society, and the great elements of the concourse are stated. Nor is this assemblage peculiar to London. It is the same in country towns, allowing for the different statistics of the population. It is the same in America. I was present at an execution in Rome for a most treacherous and wicked murder, and not only saw the same kind of assemblage there, but, wearing what is called a shooting coat with a great many pockets in it, felt innumerable hands busy in every one of them, close to the scaffold. I have already mentioned that out of 167 convicts under sentence of death, questioned at different times in the performance of his duty by an English clergyman, There were only three who had not been spectators of executions. Mr. Wakefield, in his facts relating to the punishment of death, goes into the working, as it were, of this sum. His testimony is extremely valuable because it is the evidence of an educated and observing man who, before having personal knowledge of the subject and of Newgate, was quite satisfied that the punishment of death should continue, but who, when he gained that experience, exerted himself to the utmost for its abolition, even at the pain of constant public reference in his own person to his own imprisonment. It cannot be egotism, he reasonably observes, that prompts a man to speak of himself in connection with Newgate. Whoever will undergo the pain, says Mr. Wakefield, of witnessing the public destruction of a fellow creature's life in London, must be perfectly satisfied that in the great mass of spectators, the effect of the punishment is to excite sympathy for the criminal and hatred of the law. I am inclined to believe that the criminals of London, spoken of as a class, and allowing for exceptions, take the same sort of delight in witnessing executions, as the sportsman and soldier find in the dangers of hunting and war. I am confident that few Old Bailey sessions pass without the trial of a boy, whose first thought of crime occurred whilst he was witnessing an execution, and one grown man, of great mental powers and superior education, who was acquitted of a charge of forgery, assured me that the first idea of committing a forgery occurred to him at the moment when he was accidentally witnessing the execution of Fauntleroy. To which it may be added that Fauntleroy is said to have made precisely the same declaration in reference to the origin of his own criminality. But one convict, who was within an ace of being hanged, among the many with whom Mr. Wakefield conversed, seems to me to have unconsciously put a question which the advocates of capital punishment would find it very difficult indeed to answer. "Have you often seen an execution?" asked Mr. Wakefield. "Yes, often." "Did it not frighten you?" "No, why should it?" It is very easy and very natural to turn from this ruffian, shocked by the hardened retort. But answer his question, why should it? Should he be frightened by the sight of a dead man? "We are born to die," he says with a careless triumph. "We are not born to the treadmill, or to servitude and slavery, or to banishment. But the executioner has done no more for that criminal than nature may do tomorrow for the judge, and will certainly do, in her own good time, for judge and jury, counsel and witnesses, turnkeys, hangmen, and all. Should he be frightened by the manner of the death? It is horrible, truly so horrible that the law, afraid or ashamed of its own deed, hides the face of the struggling wretch it slays. But does this fact naturally awaken in such a man terror or defiance? Let the same man speak." "What did you think then?" asked Mr. Wakefield. "Think? Why, I thought it was a shame. Disgust and indignation, or recklessness and indifference, or a morbid tendency to brood over the sight until temptation is engendered by it, are the inevitable consequences of the spectacle, according to the difference of habit and disposition in those who behold it. Why should it frighten or deter? We know it does not. We know it from the police reports, and from the testimony of those who have experience of prisons and prisoners, and we may know it, on the occasion of an execution, by the evidence of our own senses, if we will be at the misery of using them for such a purpose. But why should it? Who would send his child or his apprentice, or what tutor would send his scholars, or what master would send his servants, to be deterred from vice by the spectacle of an execution? If it be an example to criminals, and to criminals only, why are not the prisoners in Newgate brought out to see the show before the debtor's door? Why, while they are made parties to the condemned sermon, are they rigidly excluded from the improving postscript of the gallows? Because an execution is well known to be an utterly useless, barbarous, and brutalizing sight, and because the sympathy of all beholders, who have any sympathy at all, is certain to be always with the criminal, and never with the law. I learn from the newspaper accounts of every execution, how Mr. So-and-so, and Mr. somebody else, and Mr. so forth shook hands with the culprit, but I never find them shaking hands with the hangman. All kinds of attention and consideration are lavished on the one, but the other is universally avoided, like a pestilence. I want to know why so much sympathy is expended on the man who kills another in the vehemence of his own bad passions, and why the man who kills him in the name of the law is shunned and fled from. Is it because the murderer is going to die? Then by no means put him to death. Is it because the hangman executes a law, which, when they once come near it face to face, all men instinctively revolt from? Then by all means change it. There can be, no prevention in such a law. It may be urged that public executions are not intended for the benefit of those dregs of society who habitually attend them. This is an absurdity, to which the obvious answer is, so much the worse. If they be not considered with reference to that class of persons, comprehending a great host of criminals in various stages of development, they ought to be, and must be. To lose sight of that consideration is to be irrational, unjust, and cruel. All other punishments are especially devised, with a reference to the rooted habits, propensities, and antipathies of criminals. And shall it be said, out of Bedlam, that this last punishment of all is alone to be made an exception from the rule, even where it is shown to be a means of propagating vice and crime? But there may be people who do not attend executions, to whom the general fame and rumor of such scenes is an example, and a means of deterring from crime. Who are they? We have seen that around capital punishment there lingers a fascination, urging weak and bad people towards it, and imparting an interest to details connected with it, and with malefactors awaiting it or suffering it, which even good and well-disposed people cannot withstand. We know that last dying speeches and Newgate calendars are the favorite literature of very low intellects. The gallows is not appealed to as an example in the instruction of youth, unless they are training for it, nor are there condensed accounts of celebrated executions for the use of national schools. There is a story in an old spelling book of a certain don't care who was hanged at last, but it is not understood to have had any remarkable effect on crimes or executions in the generation to which it belonged, and with which it has passed away. Hogarth's idle apprentice is hanged, but the whole scene, with the unmistakable stout lady, drunk and pious in the cast, the quarreling, blasphemy, lewdness, and uproar, Titty Doll vending his gingerbread and the boys picking his pocket, is a bitter satire on the great example, as efficient then as now. Is it efficient to prevent crime? The parliamentary returns demonstrate that it is not. I was engaged in making some extracts from these documents, when I found them so well abstracted in one of the papers published by the committee on this subject, established at Aylesbury last year, by the humane exertions of Lord Nugent, that I am glad to quote the general results from its pages. In 1843, a return was laid on the table of the House of the commitments and executions for murder in England and Wales during the 30 years ending with December 1842, divided into 5 periods of 6 years each. It shows that in the last 6 years, fro to 1842, during which there were only 50 executions, the commitments for murder were fewer by 61 than in the 6 years preceding with 74 executions, fewer by 63 than in the 6 years ending 1830 with 75 executions, fewer by 56 than in the 6 years ending 1824 with 94 executions, and fewer by 93 than in the 6 years ending 1818, when there was no less a number of executions than 122. But it may be said, perhaps, that in the inference we draw from this return, we are substituting cause for effect, and that in each successive cycle, the number of murders decreased in consequence of the example of public executions in the cycle immediately preceding, and that it was for that reason there were fewer commitments. This might be said with some color of truth, if the example had been taken from 2 successive cycles only. But when the comparative examples adduced are of no less than 5 successive cycles, and the result gradually and constantly progressive in the same direction, the relation of facts to each other is determined beyond all ground for dispute, namely, that the number of these crimes has diminished in consequence of the diminution of the number of executions, more especially when it is also remembered that it was immediately after the first of these cycles of 5 years, when there had been the greatest number of executions and the greatest number of murders, that the greatest number of persons were suddenly cast loose upon the country, without employ, by the reduction of the army and navy. That then came periods of great distress and great disturbance in the agricultural and manufacturing districts, and above all, that it was during the subsequent cycles that the most important mitigations were effected in the law, and that the punishment of death was taken away not only for crimes of stealth, such as cattle and horse stealing and forgery, of which crimes corresponding statistics show likewise a corresponding decrease, but for the crimes of violence too, tending to murder, such as are many of the incendiary offenses, and such as are highway robbery and burglary. But another return, laid before the House at the same time, bears upon our argument, if possible, still more conclusively. In Table 11, we have only the years which have occurred since 1810, in which all persons convicted of murder suffered death, and, compared with these, an equal number of years in which the smallest proportion of persons convicted were executed. In the first case, there were 66 persons convicted, all of whom underwent the penalty of death. In the second were convicted, of who only were executed. Now see how these two very different methods of dealing with the crime of murder affected the commission of it in the years immediately following. The number of commitments for murder in the 4 years immediately following those in which all persons convicted were executed was 270. In the 4 years immediately following those in which little more than one-third of the persons convicted were executed, there were but 222, being 48 less. If we compare the commitments in the following years with those in the first years, we shall find that, immediately after the examples of unsparing execution, the crime increased nearly 13%, and that after commutation was the practice and capital punishment the exception, it decreased percent. In the same parliamentary return is an account of the commitments and executions in London and Middlesex, spread over a space of 32 years, ending in 1842, divided into two cycles of 16 years each. In the first of these, 34 persons were convicted of murder, all of whom were executed. In the second, 27 were convicted, and only 17 executed. The commitments for murder during the latter long period, with 17 executions, were more than one-half fewer than they had been in the former long period, with exactly double the number of executions. This appears to us to be as conclusive upon our argument as any statistical illustration can be upon any argument professing to place successive events in the relation of cause and effect to each other. How justly then is it said in that able and useful periodical work, now in the course of publication at Glasgow, under the name of the Magazine of Popular Information on Capital and Secondary Punishment, the greater the number of executions, the greater the number of murders, the smaller the number of executions, the smaller the number of murders. The lives of Her Majesty's subjects are less safe with 100 executions a year than with 50, less safe with 50 than with 25. Similar results have followed from rendering public executions more and more infrequent in Tuscany, in Prussia, in France, in Belgium. Wherever capital punishments are diminished in their number, there, crimes diminish in their number too. But the very same advocates of the punishment of death who contend, in the teeth of all facts and figures, that it does prevent crime, contend in the same breath against its abolition because it does not. There are so many bad murders, say they, and they follow in such quick succession that the punishment must not be repealed. Why, is not this a reason, among others, for repealing it? Does it not go to show that it is ineffective as an example, that it fails to prevent crime, and that it is wholly inefficient to stay that imitation or contagion, call it what you please, which brings one murder on the heels of another? One forgery came crowding on another's heels in the same way, when the same punishment attached to that crime. Since it has been removed, forgeries have diminished in a most remarkable degree. Yet within 35 years, Lord Eldon, with tearful solemnity, imagined in the House of Lords as a possibility for their lordships to shudder at, that the time might come when some visionary and morbid person might even propose the abolition of the punishment of death for forgery. And when it was proposed, Lords Lyndhurst, Winford, Tenterden, and Eldon, all law lords, opposed it. The same Lord Tenterden manfully said, on another occasion and another question, that he was glad the subject of the amendment of the laws had been taken up by Mr. Peel, who had not been bred to the law, for those who were rendered dull by habit to many of its defects. I would respectfully submit, in extension of this text, that a criminal judge is an excellent witness against the punishment of death, but a bad witness in its favor, and I will reserve this point for a few remarks in the next, concluding letter. The last English judge, I believe, who gave expression to a public and judicial opinion in favor of the punishment of death, is Mr. Justice Coleridge, who, in charging the grand jury at Hertford last year, took occasion to lament the presence of serious crimes in the calendar, and to say that he feared that they were referable to the comparative infrequency of capital punishment. It is not incompatible with the utmost deference and respect for an authority so eminent to say that, in this, Mr. Justice Coleridge was not supported by facts, but quite the reverse. He went out of his way to found a general assumption on certain very limited and partial grounds, and even on those grounds was wrong. For among the few crimes which he instanced, murder stood prominently forth. Now persons found guilty of murder are more certainly and unsparingly hanged at this time, as the parliamentary returns demonstrate, than such criminals ever were. So how can the decline of public executions affect that class of crimes? As to persons committing murder, and yet not found guilty of it by juries, they escape solely because there are many public executions, not because there are none or few. But when I submit that a criminal judge is an excellent witness against capital punishment, but a bad witness in its favor, I do so on more broad and general grounds than apply to this error in fact and deduction. So I presume to consider it, on the part of the distinguished judge in question, and they are grounds which do not apply offensively to judges, as a class, than whom there are no authorities in England so deserving of general respect and confidence, or so possessed of it, but which apply alike to all men in their several degrees and pursuits. It is certain that men contract a general liking for those things which they have studied at great cost of time and intellect, and their proficiency in which has led to their becoming distinguished and successful. It is certain that out of this feeling arises, not only that passive blindness to their defects, of which the example given by my Lord Tenterden was quoted in the last letter, but an active disposition to advocate and defend them. If it were otherwise, if it were not for this spirit of interest and partisanship, no single pursuit could have that attraction for its votaries which most pursuits in course of time establish. Thus, legal authorities are usually jealous of innovations on legal principles. Thus, it is described of the lawyer in the introductory discourse to the description of Utopia that he said of a proposal against capital punishment, "This could never be so established in England, but that it must needs bring the will public into great jeopardy and hazard." And as he was thus saying, he shaked his head and made a wry mouth, and so he held his peace. Thus the Recorder of London, in 1811, objected to the capital part being taken off from the offence of picking pockets. Thus the Lord Chancellor, in 1813, objected to the removal of the penalty of death from the offence of stealing to the amount of 5 shillings from a shop. Thus, Lord Ellenborough, in 1820, anticipated the worst effects from there being no punishment of death for stealing 5 shillings worth of wet linen from a bleaching ground. Thus the Solicitor General, in 1830, advocated the punishment of death for forgery, and the satisfaction of thinking, in the teeth of mountains of evidence from bankers and other injured parties, 1,000 bankers alone, that he was deterring persons from the commission of crime by the severity of the law. Thus, Mr. Justice Coleridge delivered his charge at Hertford in 1845. Thus there were in the Criminal Code of England, in 1790, 160 crimes punishable with death. Thus the lawyer has said, again and again, in his generation, that any change in such a state of things must needs bring the weal public into jeopardy and hazard. And thus he has, all through the dismal history, shaked his head and made a wry mouth and held his peace. Except a glorious exception, when such lawyers as Bacon, Moore, Blackstone, Romilly, and let us ever gratefully remember, in later times Mr. Basil Montagu, have striven, each in his day, within the utmost limits of the endurance of the mistaken feeling of the people or the legislature of the time, to champion and maintain the truth. There is another and a stronger reason still, why a criminal judge is a bad witness in favor of the punishment of death. He is a chief actor in the terrible drama of a trial, where the life or death of a fellow creature is at issue. No one who has seen such a trial can fail to know, or can ever forget, its intense interest. I care not how painful this interest is to the good, wise judge upon the bench. I admit its painful nature, and the judge's goodness and wisdom to the fullest extent. But I submit that his prominent share in the excitement of such a trial, and the dread mystery involved, has a tendency to bewilder and confuse the judge upon the general subject of that penalty. I know the solemn pause before the verdict, the bush and stifling of the fever in the court, the solitary figure brought back to the bar, and standing there, observed of all the outstretched heads and gleaming eyes, to be next minute stricken dead, as one may say, among them. I know the thrill that goes round when the black cap is put on, and how there will be shrieks among the women, and a taking out of someone in a swoon. And when the judge's faltering voice delivers sentence, how awfully the prisoner and he confront each other. Two mere men, destined one day, however far removed from one another at this time, to stand, alike as suppliants at the bar of God. I know all this, I can imagine what the office of the judge costs in this execution of it. But I say that in these strong sensations he is lost, and is unable to abstract the penalty as a preventive or example, from an experience of it, and from associations surrounding it, which are and can be only his and his alone. Not to contend that there is no amount of wig or ermine that can change the nature of the man inside. Not to say that the nature of a judge may be, like the dyer's hand, subdued to what it works in, and may become too used to this punishment of death to consider it quite dispassionately. Not to say that it may possibly be inconsistent to have, deciding as calm authorities in favor of death, judges who have been constantly sentencing to death. I contend that for the reasons I have stated, alone, a judge, and especially a criminal judge, is a bad witness for the punishment but an excellent witness against it. inasmuch as in the latter case his conviction of its inutility has been so strong and paramount as utterly to beat down and conquer these adverse incidents. I have no scruple in stating this position, because, for anything I know, the majority of excellent judges now on the bench may have overcome them, and may be opposed to the punishment of death under any circumstances. I mentioned that I would devote a portion of this letter to a few prominent illustrations of each head of objection to the punishment of death. Those on record are so very numerous that selection is extremely difficult, but in reference to the possibility of mistake and the impossibility of reparation, one case is as good, I should rather say as bad as 100. And if there were none but Eliza Fennings, that would be sufficient. Nay, if there were none at all, it would be enough to sustain this objection, that men of finite and limited judgment do inflict, on testimony which admits of doubt, an infinite and irreparable punishment. But there are on record numerous instances of mistake, many of them very generally known and immediately recognizable in the following summary, which I copy from the New York report already referred to. There have been cases in which groans have been heard in the apartment of the crime, which have attracted the steps of those on whose testimony the case has turned. When, on proceeding to the spot, they have found a man bending over the murdered body, a lantern in the left hand, and the knife yet dripping with the warm current in the blood-stained right, with horror-stricken countenance, and lips which, in the presence of the dead, seem to refuse to deny the crime in the very act of which he is thus surprised. And yet the man has been, many years after, when his memory alone could be benefited by the discovery, ascertained not to have been the real murderer. There have been cases in which, in a house in which were two persons alone, a murder has been committed on one of them, when many additional circumstances have fastened the imputation upon the other, and when, all apparent modes of access from without being closed inward, the demonstration has seemed complete of the guilt for which that other has suffered the doom of the law, yet suffered innocently. There have been cases in which a father has been found murdered in an outhouse, the only person at home being a son, sworn by a sister to have been dissolute and undutiful, and anxious for the death of the father, and succession to the family property. When the track of his shoes in the snow is found from the house to the spot of the murder, and the hammer with which it was committed, known as his own, found on a search in the corner of one of his private drawers, with the bloody evidence of the deed only imperfectly effaced from it, and yet the son has been innocent. The sister, years after, on her deathbed, confessing herself the fratricide as well as the parricide. There have been cases in which men have been hung on the most positive testimony to identity, aided by many suspicious circumstances, by persons familiar with their appearance, which have afterwards proved grievous mistakes, growing out of remarkable personal resemblance. There have been cases in which two men have been seen fighting in a field, an old enmity existing between them, the one found dead, killed by a stab from a pitchfork known as belonging to the other, and which that other had been carrying, the pitchfork lying by the side of the murdered man, and yet its owner has been afterwards found not to have been the author of the murder of which it had been the instrument, the true murderer sitting on the jury that tried him. There have been cases in which an innkeeper has been charged by one of his servants with the murder of a traveler, the servant deposing to having seen his master on the stranger's bed, strangling him, and afterwards rifling his pockets. Another servant deposing that she saw him come down at that time at a very early hour in the morning, steal into the garden, take gold from his pocket, and carefully wrapping it up bury it in a designated spot, on the search of which the ground is found loose and freshly dug, and a sum of 30 pounds in gold found buried according to the description. The master, who confessed the burying of the money, with many evidences of guilt in his hesitation and confusion, has been hung of course, and proved innocent only too late. There have been cases in which a traveler has been robbed on the highway of 20 guineas, which he had taken the precaution to mark. One of these is found to have been paid away or changed by one of the servants of the inn, which the traveler reaches the same evening. The servant is about the height of the robber, who had been cloaked and disguised. His master deposes to his having been recently unaccountably extravagant and flush of gold, and on his trunk being searched the other 19 marked guineas, and the traveler's purse are found there, the servant being asleep at the time, half drunk. He is of course convicted and hung, for the crime of which his master was the author. There have been cases in which a father and daughter have been overheard in violent dispute, the words barbarity, cruelly, and death being heard frequently to proceed from the latter. The former goes out locking the door behind him. Groans are overheard, and the words, "Cruel father, thou art the cause of my death." On the room being opened, she is found on the point of death from a wound in her side, and near her the knife with which it had been inflicted. and on being questioned as to her owing her death to her father, her last motion before expiring is an expression of assent. The father, on returning to the room, exhibits the usual evidences of guilt. He, too, is of course hung. And it is not till nearly a year afterwards that, on the discovery of conclusive evidence that it was a suicide, the vain reparation is made to his memory by the public authorities, of waving a pair of colors over his grave in token of the recognition of his innocence. More than 100 such cases are known, it is said in this report, in English criminal jurisprudence. The same report contains 3 striking cases of supposed criminals being unjustly hanged in America, and also 5 more in which people whose innocence was not afterwards established were put to death on evidence as purely circumstantial and as doubtful, to say the least of it, as any that was held to be sufficient in this general summary of legal murders. Mr. O'Connell defended, in Ireland, within 25 years, 3 brothers who were hanged for a murder of which they were afterwards shown to have been innocent. I cannot find the reference at this moment, but I have seen it stated on good authority, that, but for the exertions, I think of the present Lord Chief Baron, 6 or 7 innocent men would certainly have been hanged. Such are the instances of wrong judgment which are known to us. How many more there may be in which the real murderers never disclosed their guilt, or were never discovered, and where the odium of great crimes still rests on guiltless people, long since resolved to dust in their untimely graves, no human power can tell. The effect of public executions on those who witness them requires no better illustration, and can have none, than the scene which any execution in itself presents, and the general police office knowledge of the offenses arising out of them. I have stated my belief that the study of rude scenes leads to the disregard of human life and to murder. Referring, since that expression of opinion, to the very last trial for murder in London, I have made inquiry, and am assured that the youth now under sentence of death in Newgate for the murder of his master in Drury Lane was a vigilant spectator of the 3 last public executions in this city. What affects a daily increasing familiarity with the scaffold, and with death upon it, wrought in France in the Great Revolution, everybody knows. In reference to this very question of capital punishment, Robespierre himself, before he was in blood stepped in so far, warned the National Assembly that in taking human life, and in displaying before the eyes of the people scenes of cruelty and the bodies of murdered men, the law awakened ferocious prejudices, which gave birth to a long and growing train of their own kind. With how much reason this was said, let his own detestable name bear witness. If we would know how callous and hardened society, even in a peaceful and settled state, becomes to public executions when they are frequent, let us recollect how few they were who made the last attempt to stay the dreadful Monday morning spectacles of men and women strung up in a row for crimes as different in their degree as our whole social scheme is different in its component parts, which, within some 15 years or so, made human shambles of the Old Bailey. There is no better way of testing the effect of public executions on those who do not actually behold them, but who read of them and know of them, than by inquiring into their efficiency in preventing crime. In this respect they have always and in all countries failed. According to all facts and figures, failed. In Russia, in Spain, in France, in Italy, in Belgium, in Sweden, in England, there has been one result. In Bombay, during the recordership of Sir James Mackintosh, there were fewer crimes in 7 years without one execution than in the preceding 7 years with 47 executions. Notwithstanding that in the 7 years without capital punishment, the population had greatly increased, and there had been a large accession to the numbers of the ignorant and licentious soldiery, with whom the more violent offences originated. During the 4 wickedest years of the Bank of England, fro to 1817, inclusive, when the £1 note capital prosecutions were most numerous and shocking, the number of forged £1 notes discovered by the bank steadily increased, from the gross amount in the first year of £10,342 to the gross amount in the last of £28,412. But in every branch of this part of the subject, the inefficiency of capital punishment to prevent crime, and its efficiency to produce it, the body of evidence, if there were space to quote or analyze it here, is overpowering and resistless. I have purposely deferred, until now, any reference to one objection, which is urged against the abolition of capital punishment. I mean that objection which claims to rest on scriptural authority. It was excellently well said by Lord Melbourne, that no class of persons can be shown to be very miserable and oppressed, but some supporters of things as they are will immediately rise up and assert, not that those persons are moderately well-to-do, or that their lot in life has a reasonably bright side, but that they are, of all sorts and conditions of men, the happiest. In like manner, when a certain proceeding or institution is shown to be very wrong indeed, there is a class of people who rush to the fountainhead at once, and will have no less an authority for it than the Bible on any terms. So, we have the Bible appealed to in behalf of capital punishment. So, we have the Bible produced as a distinct authority for slavery. So, American representatives find the title of their country to the Oregon Territory distinctly laid down in the book of Genesis. So, in course of time, we shall find repudiation, perhaps, expressly commanded in the sacred writings.